In conversation with Mark David Gerson. Mark David Gerson is a founder of the Mark David Gerson School of Writing and best-selling author of more than 20 books. His nonfiction include popular titles for writers, inspiring personal growth books, and compelling memoirs. As a novelist, he is best known for two series, The Legend of Canana fantasies coming soon to movie theaters, and the Sara Stories set in his native Canada. When not writing, Mark David coaches an international roster of both first-time and seasoned writers to help them get their stories onto the page and into the world with clarity, confidence, and creativity. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure and excitement to have on the show today, Mark David Gerson. Welcome on the show, Mark.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm so excited really to have you on the show today. I haven't checked through some of your amazing book, which I think you've got a trunkload of it. I'm quite excited we are here to see it and talk about it. So thank you so much for coming on. Quite exciting you're here today.
Delighted to be here, and I'm always happy to talk about my books.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I need to first say that I am taken aback by the description page of your book, The Moon Quest, which is the first book in the Legend of Canana fantasies in Amazon. And I'm quite excited I'm starting with this for a start for the conversation. But I'd love to ask you the many obvious question most authors get asked. What inspired you to write The Moon Quest, and how did the whole series of itself come to be on itself too?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's probably an answer you haven't heard before. I did not have an idea for a fantasy book or a fantasy series. I did not have a conscious desire to write a fantasy series. In 1997, as I always do in my workshops, I led my students through a guided visualization into writing. And what I did that I'd never ever done before is I did the exercise while they were writing. Normally, when I have workshop participants, I like to keep my attention on them in case anybody needs anything. But I'd worked with this group of people before, and so I began the exercise. I began to write, and what came out of me that evening was a very peculiar story, very peculiar scene about an unusual looking man who is sitting on a horse-drawn coach. The horses are strangely colored. The coach is kind of strange itself.
Wow.
And that scene, when I finished, I thought, well, that's very peculiar. And the next morning, I woke up and I read it over again. I thought, you know what? I want to see where this is going. And I had no idea what the story was. I didn't have a title yet. All I had was that scene, which ended up becoming the first scene of the first draft of a novel I knew absolutely nothing about, except as I was writing it every day. And initially, of course, it was a one-off. There was no series. There was just this book that had no title. About a third of the way through that first draft, I had a title. And I began to get a sense of what the story was about, but only in the broadest terms. Really, as I say, I didn't really know the story, except every day as I was writing it, sometimes from one sentence to the next. By the time I finished the first draft and had a title, I thought, you know what, I think there are two more books in this series. I didn't know what they would be about. One of them would be called The Star Quest. And as you can see, it did actually happen. One of them would be called The Star Quest, and one of them would be called The Sun Quest. But again, I had no idea what those stories were going to be. And it was some years after the Moon Quest came out that the Star Quest happened, and then the Sun Quest happened. And then I thought I was done. I had a trilogy. It was called the Canana Trilogy. Canana is the land where these stories are set, the mythical land where these stories are set. And about 5 years later, I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time, and I woke up one morning and I thought, I kind of think there's more to the story. I thought, no, there can't be more to the story, because in the Sun Quest, everything gets wrapped up. The bad guy gets taken care of. It's over. How can there be more to the story? So I thought, well, I'm going to sit down. I'm going to see if I'm going to try to write a scene. So I sat down and I wrote a scene, and the scene that I wrote, again, with no clear idea what it would be about or where it was going, was bedtime for a young boy who's being told a bedtime story by his mother.
Okay.
And in this world, in this land, um, the Moon Quest, the Star Quest, the Sun Quest are many generations ago, so far back that they're now history, myth, and legend.
Yeah.
And so this boy's favorite stories are these stories, these quest stories.
Mm.
So she tells him his absolute favorite story, the Sun Quest story. And
Wow.
when she gets to the end, she says, the end. And the little boy, who has never stayed awake this long to hear the end of the story, says, it's not the end. And she
Wow.
says, of course it's the end. And he
Wow.
said, no, it's not the end. There's more to the story. And she says, no, this is all there is to this story. And
Wow.
then I like to say my stories are smarter than I am, and this is where it really showed up. The young boy, and I'm writing this again, I'm not making this up except as I go along. The young boy says, but he says, in the Moon Quest story that you told me, doesn't Elisha, one of the characters, say, there's more to every story?
Mm.
Stories always continue. There's more to every story. And
Wow.
as I wrote that, coming out of this little kid's mouth, I thought, well, I guess there's more to the story.
Oh
And it
my
turned
goodness.
it turned out there was, and that became, where's that one? That became
Wow.
this book, which is The Bard of Bryn Dune, which is the fourth book in the
Wow.
series.
Oh
And the
wow.
legend and the Cantana trilogy became the Legend of Cantana, because you can't have a trilogy with more than three books, right?
Yeah.
So and now I'm working on the fifth book in the series, which is called The Lost Horse of Bryn Dune. And I
Wow.
already know the title of the sixth book in the series.
Wow.
And I don't think that's the end of it, but that's as much as I know right now.
You've got a lot on going, Mark David. That's quite a lot, really. You've got, I don't know. I hope you find some time to sleep, do you?
Sleep?
Yeah?
What's that?
Sleep. You say, what's that?
I'll try not to fall asleep while we're talking. How about that?
Oh, but
Yes, I do
that's,
find time to sleep, and I find time to teach, and I find time to coach other writers, which means the books don't get written quite as quickly as I would like them to get
oh,
written.
yeah, because that's quite amazing, really. I love your answer to that question because you never thought all of this is actually gonna come. You're just following the ride, just following the flow, and on and on
I'm
and on.
following
It
the.
keeps going
I
from
like
one
that you
part.
said following the ride, because when
Yeah,
I teach writing, one of the things that I tell my students, and I say this in some of my books as well, is
mm,
that when I'm writing, I imagine I'm in a car,
yeah.
but I'm not in the driver's seat.
You're not a driver.
I'm in the passenger seat, and the story
Mm,
is in the
yeah,
driver's seat. And so I
interesting.
just have to hang on and watch the story unfold. And
Mm,
that's how these books and the Sarah books actually happened. I really did not know what the story was going to be. And with the Lost Horse, the book I'm working on right now,
mm,
I have a vague sense of what happens to a few of the characters at the end, but
mm.
really I have no idea how the story ends yet.
It's just so beautiful. I just have to sit there and follow the ride and see what the story metamorphose from one part to another, from the first to the second to the third, and on and on and on. It keep going in a way that you never plan. Because from your response, because there are actually two types of writers: the one that plan out what they wanted to write on, and one that just leave it to just go whatever way it wanted to go. So it's quite amazing. All of these things can could go on with you having a bunch of 21 books. That's quite a lot, to be frankly speaking, and quite commendable. Well done, I'd
Thank,
say.
thank you. And yeah, I don't outline anything. I don't plan anything. I
Yeah.
don't plot
From your
anything.
response, you know you don't outline.
I have no idea. And I like Stephen King once said that he
Yeah.
said, if I don't know what's going to happen next, my readers aren't going to know what's going to happen next.
Oh,
So,
wow.
because he doesn't outline either, I understand. So, yeah, I discover the story the same way you discover the story.
That's
It's
interesting,
easier for
really.
you because you just have to read it. I have to write it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's the same thing.
Absolutely. That's great. And also, see, you have another book titled Sara Stories, starting with the
The
fourth
Sarah
book.
Stories is a series. Is that too was not supposed to be a series.
Oh,
Um, it was going to be a one-off book called Sarah's Year, and in this case, I had an idea for a story,
yeah.
um, and it was loosely based on a family story. And I sat down. Well, this was back in, I think, 2014 or 2015. I was actually in LA at the time, and I sat down in a Starbucks in Santa Monica
Mm,
with this idea for this story.
Yeah.
And I began to write the first scene. I already had the title, and the title made sense in the context of what I thought the story was going to be. So I had this title. And by the time I got up from writing that opening scene in that Starbucks, the story had changed. My idea for the story was gone. I had
Wow.
a whole new character. I had no idea why he was there. And I
Wow.
kept saying, so then I thought, well, because the original idea for Sarah's year was it was going to be a year in the life of this woman named Sarah.
Mm,
And
mm,
suddenly that wasn't the story anymore. And I thought, well, the title must be wrong, right? The title doesn't make
mm.
any sense anymore. Where's the
Yeah.
year? Sarah's there, but where's the year? Because the story, in fact, takes place in 36 hours with lots of flashbacks, but in 36
36
hours.
hours.
36 hours is not a year, right? So
That's
uh,
just three. That's just 3 days, I think.
3 days, but
That-
again, lots of flashbacks to the past.
That's one. That's one day. That's 1.5 day.
1.5 days.
24 hours a day. 1.5 day.
That's right.
Wow.
So, but I kept saying, okay, well, I need to change the
Wow.
title, right? Well, I said a moment ago that my stories are smarter than I am. And
Oh.
I listen, and I just kept feeling, no, the title is right. The title is right. Don't touch the title.
Mm.
Well, it took me until one of the last scenes of that first draft before I understood why the book was called that. And it made perfect
Wow.
sense. Just not the sense I thought it was going to make at the beginning.
Wow. That's amazing. Also, I wanted to point this out too. From Sarah's year, it delves a bit into the themes of dreams, friendship, and the passage of time, all set against the backdrop of Jewish Montreal. I wanted to
Yeah.
ask you before, what inspired you to explore these themes and how did your own experience maybe
So,
influence the creation of that
yeah,
as
well,
well?
so what happened was the idea I had for the story, as I say, was loosely based on a family story. And the
Yeah.
story begins at a funeral, at the graveside of a funeral.
Oh,
And a woman has died. And that woman is actually very loosely based on my own mother. And at the graveside is her oldest friend. Her oldest friend is named Sarah. And in the story that I was writing, not the real story, Esther, the character based on my mother, and Sarah grew up together in Jewish Montreal in the 1930s,
mm,
um, and both had great dreams. Esther wanted to be a famous painter, a famous artist, and
yeah.
Sarah wanted to be a famous writer, a famous author. Now, of course,
Oh,
you have to recognize that between the times and the culture and the war coming up, for young women at that time, those dreams were likely impossible.
mm,
Um, they got married, they had kids, life went on. The dreams fell by the wayside. The original idea for the story,
mm,
when Sarah was at Esther's graveside, she was going to realize that she had not lived her. Esther had died with her dreams unfulfilled, and
uh,
Sarah said, "I can't do that." And the original story was, in the next year, over the next year, Sarah was going to rediscover her dream of being a writer. In fact, what ended up happening was that at the graveside, as I'm writing, it's
yeah.
not just Sarah, but Esther's son is there. And the
Oh,
next 36 hours take place mostly between Esther's son and Sarah as they
oh,
each
wow.
discover their dreams
Mm,
and as they each move forward with their lives in ways they could never have predicted.
mm.
Uh, and it's the present day in that story is in the mid 90s, I think, but the
Oh, wow.
flashbacks go back to the 30s, 40s, 50s,
Wow.
um, and through those flashbacks, we learn more about Esther, we learn more about Sarah, and we learn more about Bernie, Esther's son,
Mm,
and we learn about family secrets that become
wow.
revealed through this. And it's revealing those family secrets that when Sarah reveals those family secrets to Bernie, things Bernie did not know about his parents and his
Mm,
family, that is in fact what, in a sense, makes it possible for Bernie to let go the kind of the safe life that he had been living and
yeah.
follow dreams he didn't even know he had. And so the tagline for the book, for that book, is "It's never too late to follow your dreams."
Oh wow. That's quite
Now,
a
now, just let me just go on, because when that story, when I finished writing Sarah's Year, I thought that was it. One book, one story. Again, everyone lives happily ever after. That's the end of it. Um, and then I had readers who would come to me and say, "Loved the book, but what happens?
what happened next?
What happens to these people? What happens
Yeah,
to
the
Sarah? What
characters.
happens to Bernie, who's Esther's son? What happens to other characters who I don't want to name right now because I don't want to give the story away?" And and I thought, well, that's really interesting. And I thought, well, who do I want to know what happens to, as the author, as the creator of this world? And I thought, you know what? Yeah, I want to know what happens to Bernie, and yeah, I want to know what happens to these people. But what I really want to know about is what happens to Esther's sister, who is the bitch from hell in the first book.
Oh
She
wow.
is horrible, 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 horrible. And
Wow.
I thought, how does someone become that way?
Hmm.
How does someone who grew up in the same house as Esther, same parents, same street, same story, how does
Hmm.
she become such a horrible person?
Oh
And
wow.
so she is not the only part of the next book, because the other character, we see the other characters as well. But
Yeah.
that was what inspired me to write the next book, which I called After Sarah's Year. And then
Ah,
I thought that was done.
you were
And
wrong.
then I was wrong. And then one day I woke up with an idea for a third book in the series.
Oh goodness.
And I had the same thing that happened with Sarah's Year happened with the Emmeline papers. I had a title and I had an idea.
Yeah.
And by the end of the first day's writing, the title stayed and the idea was gone.
Oh
And
wow.
I had a whole new story.
Oh wow. That's quite amazing. I mean, I love hearing your stories and the making of these books. It sounds quite beautiful, quite amazing, and quite lovely to me, and quite interesting as well as motivating as well. I mean, all
Thank
of
you.
these things just keep unfolding and unfolding in a beautiful, and great, dynamic manner. And I would like us to talk about readers' feedbacks. Because one of the things
Sure.
that interests me most as a writer is to sit back and listen to readers' feedbacks. And you may want to agree with me that one of the things that makes literature to be quite complex is the fact that it can be interpreted in different ways by different readers based on their opinions. And sometimes some readers might get a message intended by the author. Sometimes they might be close to getting the message. Sometimes they might be far, say a kilometer or several miles away from getting the message. And sometimes they might just hilariously misunderstand the message and interpret the book upside down. You know,
Right.
I need to dramatize that. As hilariously fun as this sound, I would like to ask you, how do you feel when readers interpret your works differently than you intended? How does that make you feel as a writer?
I think one of the beauties of fiction is
Yeah.
just that, is the
Mm.
fact that each every person reads, when we see a movie,
Yeah.
the world is painted for us on the screen, right?
Yeah.
When we read a book, we paint that world for ourselves.
Absolutely.
And every person is going to paint that world slightly differently or radically differently, as you said.
Yeah.
As an author, I think it's so amazing
Yeah.
that I can put words on a page. I can put words on a page, and you can read those words, and he can read those words, and she can read those words, and you're all going to pull something
Different.
somewhat different
Hmm.
from what you read.
Yeah.
It becomes, I mean, you just use the word dynamic. It becomes a dynamic experience
Yeah.
that, as powerful as the movies are, this excites our imagination in
Mm.
ways that movies never can,
Yeah.
and our emotions in ways the movies never can. And it's funny because, when I was writing the Moon Quest, there were two scenes that I wrote, after the third or fourth draft,
Wow.
that were very, very powerful and a little bit violent, well, not more than a little bit violent. It's kind of like with the Sarah's Year title, where I knew the title was right, but I didn't know why.
Yeah.
Somehow I knew these scenes had to be part of the story, and I
Oh.
didn't understand why.
Oh.
And I kept looking for excuses to remove them because I didn't want to be seen as someone who could write such violent scenes. And in the end, the scene stayed in, and it
Wow.
took a reader to tell me, to explain to me, the author, why those scenes were so important to my story.
You see? Imagine
I
that.
could not see it
Imagine.
until he said, "Don't you get it?" And he explained why they were so not only important but critical to the story. And finally, I
Yeah.
said, "Oh my God! Now I see."
Wow. This is very important, really. I mean, this, like you mentioned, this is one of the things that makes book conversation and book club meetings to be quite fun.
Sure,
Is the fact that we can read the same book, and the first person review, the second person and third person would differ slightly from one another, or even completely from one another,
sure,
and to the point that you got to thinking that, did you read the same book that I read? I
right.
mean, I don't know. Was it another title, the same title written by a slightly different author, or is the same book that I just read that you're talking about? So it's quite different and quite beautiful. And as an author, I
Yeah.
think it's a fun thing to just sit back and watch people talk about it and share their experience. Like, oh really? Oh wow, I never saw that coming, but thank you. Oh wow, that's quite. So it's creates a very lovely and beautiful feeling that I think it's quite fun. Really.
So when I teach writers,
Yeah.
because as a writer, my ego mind, if you will, would love to be able to control your experience. I want you to, as a writer, I want you to have my experience. But as a reader,
Mm,
as you just described, we don't
yeah.
want that. So when I teach writing, I remind writers of that you want to leave spaces for people to have their own experience. And
Absolutely.
I kind of liken writing fiction to creating an impressionist painting
Mm,
where it's not like a photograph. There's spaces between the dots where we can each see what we want, what is ours to see.
mm.
Um, and I think that again creates space that more controlled writing doesn't allow for.
I love your take on that. That's very true, really. Quite beautiful and quite fun. And I can go on and on and on and on and on with it. Very
I can
amazing.
too. So
Very amazing, Mark David. It's quite beautiful. And as somebody like you who has written 20 books that span multiple genres, first of all, I wanted to ask you, how were you able to work based on different genres? How do you come about that? That's my first question. And also, I'm always surprised with the way novelists like you would sit down and craft sentences and craft lines, paragraphs that make pages, sentences that make paragraphs, pages that make chapters, chapters that make a great novel, and like you, novels that make one, two, three, four, five, six numbers and ending. Yeah, it's always leave me thinking, how did they get the idea? Where are these words coming from? Where are these sentences coming from? In a way that keep transitioning beautifully, in a way that keep going smoothly, and the story keep unfolding from one series to another over and over again. It got me wondering, this must be such a strange skill to have as person. But then I'll leave it to you as far as writing is concerned. How do you get the inspirations to write these books?
well,
Where do they come
let me
from?
back up to your first question in terms of the genres.
Yeah,
Um, I, as I mentioned with the Moon Quest, I had no conscious desire to write fantasy, and suddenly I have a fantasy series.
imagine.
Um, I write the stories, whether they're fiction or nonfiction, that in a sense want to be written by me.
Hmm.
I say the stories choose me. I don't choose the stories.
Wow.
So I've written fantasy. I have written fiction, general literary fiction. I've
Yeah,
written books for writers. That may make the most sense because I teach writing.
yeah.
I write self-help books. I write inspirational books. I write memoirs. Well, what I write next is whatever story goes. It's my turn.
Hello, Mark David. It's time to explore poetry.
Right. Well, there's another fantasy author, Michael Scott, who's written a wonderful series. And he said something like, sometimes we choose the stories, and sometimes the stories choose
Choose
us.
us.
And I think in my case, in almost every instance, the story
Hmm.
has chosen me.
Wow.
And sometimes I've tried to say no, but to borrow from Star Trek, resistance is futile, and in the end I always say yes. But that's how I end up writing across all these genres, because a particular story, fiction or nonfiction, a particular idea says, write me. And so,
Yeah,
and so
when you say no, it keeps speaking in your head that you can't say no. I'm talking
can't
to
say
you.
no.
Write this thing. Like,
Yeah,
hold on, I'm trying to get it off. No, you're trying to
yeah,
get off the word or the voice from your head, but it keep coming back
exactly.
time and time over again. I said, I will not let you go except you do this.
Exactly, exactly. I kind of have this image because I have more ideas. I have more book ideas um, battling for me than I have time to write them. I have this kind of image of all my book ideas kind of up here fighting it
Mm.
out as to who's going to be next. But
Wow,
to your second question, I think the simplest answer is I don't think when I'm writing.
that's
I
strange.
don't. I don't think. I simply surrender to the story
Hmm.
and I allow the words and the phrases and the sentences and the paragraphs and the
Do their
chapters
thing.
to reveal themselves to me. Again, let's go back
Wow.
to the Moon Quest, where I didn't
Mm.
even know the story as I was writing it. And
Wow.
some days I didn't know what was going to happen from one sentence to the next. So for me, creation is an act of allowing. It's
Mm.
allowing the
Yeah,
story to
not of
tell itself
allowing.
to me and through me, and getting out of the way so the story can find its way onto the page. Not my way, its way. Because I can promise you that, again, going back to the Moon Quest, there were plenty of times when I wanted to say, no, I can't do that. I can't
Mm.
write that. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
But it always did. If I
Wow.
got out of the way and let it, it
Wow.
always eventually made sense.
Wow.
And as I keep going from book to book, I still have that experience. I'm having that experience with the book I'm working on right now, The Lost Horse of Bryndoon.
Mm.
I'm tens of thousands into the story, and I'm still saying, this just doesn't make any sense. I don't see how this comes together. And
Mm.
then I have to remember that I've written 7 novels already, and it has always come together.
Mm.
Even in all those moments when I have said, just like now, this doesn't make any sense, it can't possibly work, it has always worked because I'm in the passenger seat, not in the
Yeah.
driver's seat.
Mm. Oh, this is actually very beautiful. I love your answers to this question. It's quite fun and very beautiful. And I like to take a note of, I love that statement you made. Creation is an act of allowing, just allowing it. Creation is an act of allowing. I love that statement. It resonates so deeply as a writer. That's quite
So
beautiful.
let me give I don't read the Bible, I'm not religious, but let's go back to Genesis when God creates the world.
The word.
God doesn't make the world, God doesn't manufacture light. God
Mm.
says, let there be light.
Delight.
Creation, even in Genesis, is an act of allowing.
He allows the light to come up. Mm.
Exactly. And here's
Interesting.
the other piece of that I love to share when I'm
Yeah.
teaching. So at the end of each day, right, God doesn't look at what he's created and say, what a pile of crap that was. Right? He doesn't say that. He says, and it was good. The
Well,
act of creating makes it good.
that's beautiful. This is amazing. And your answers are quite thought provoking, really, quite didactic as well, instructive and educative. Thank you very much for mentioning. Thank
Thank you.
you.
That's why I started the writing school.
And actually, I would like us to talk about it now. Yeah,
Sure.
you're a published author and also a writing coach. You founded a writing school and have taught and coached writers for a long time.
A long
Now, I
time.
wanted to ask you, do you have any piece of advice for writers out there who are struggling with publishing a book?
Well, let's talk about struggling with writing a book before
Yeah,
publishing a book,
yeah,
and that just goes back to everything we've talked about. Stop trying to control the story
yeah.
and the characters and the outcome. So get in the passenger seat and let the story happen. Imagine you're in a car with someone who drives crazy, over the speed limit, takes really sharp curves, and you're hanging on to the handle over the door for
You'd
dear
be
life,
scared.
and you're scared, and you're pumping the footwell on the passenger side, hoping there's a brake there, and there isn't, right?
Yeah, I do that a
Yeah.
lot.
So sometimes when you're in the passenger seat of the car and the story is driving, it's just like that.
Mm,
But here's the thing: you got your seatbelt on, right? You're safe. You're hanging on, and the story isn't going to crash.
yeah.
So again, your only job, is to allow the story to move itself through you, to trust the words, the characters, if it's fiction, to have their way with you, and to tell you their story.
Mm.
Um, so when I said before, we choose some stories and some stories choose us. I
Yeah,
believe in the end that all our stories, if it's the right story for us, all our stories choose us.
matters. Yeah.
So if the story chose you, then it's your story to write.
Mm.
But it's the story's story to tell
Mm.
you what to write.
What to? Oh wow, that's beautiful. That is concentrated. That statement needs to be broken down in pieces. It is very huge. It is one that you have to take notes. I'm not sure that you get back to it later.
Well,
Back
you
to
can
it later and utilize
you can watch the video again too.
again, you know.
But that's also why I have books for writers. This was
Oh
this
yeah.
one is
Felt in
called
your book.
Even if you don't know what it's about. You can't. There
Oh
you
wow,
go.
that's a lovely subtitle.
Yeah. So but I have books. I have books on writer's block. I have books on screenwriting. I have a book on memoir writing,
Mm.
and I have a book that's kind of a more spiritual approach to writing.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, which all my books of writing really are. So, everything I'm talking about is in all these books.
Mm. I like the fact that you mentioned a more spiritual approach to writing, because sometimes I think writing could even be a spiritual journey, because it's just
Well,
like a strange things coming to your head and you don't know where it's coming from, and to me, it
I
just
believe
feels
it
so
all.
spiritual.
I believe that when we write the stories that are ours to write,
Yeah,
when we get out of the way of those stories, then it
yeah,
is a spiritual. Then it is a
yeah,
spiritual experience.
absolutely. I think about that too. I believe that as well. Wow, thank you so much. This is quite amazing. I love your take of this so far, and it's quite amazing. And just in case we have some viewers who are watching this interview, I would love to get a copy of any of your books. On what platform are they available on for purchase?
Yeah. So if you're in the U.S., you can always get them from my website, which is markdavidgerson.com.
Yeah.
Um, but they're available globally on Amazon, in paperback and on Kindle. They're
Mm.
available globally from all online booksellers in paperback and ebook. So, if you have access to Kindle, Nook, Apple Books, Google Play,
Yeah.
other platforms, might also add that the Moon Quest
Mm.
is also now available as an audiobook. I
Interesting.
recorded the Moon Quest myself, which
Oh,
was
that's
quite an
beautiful.
experience about a year and a half ago, and it's available right now on Audible and Apple Books.
I love it when authors tell their own story, when they narrate their own story with their own voice, because it feels so
It
much
was a
personal and
very
much interesting.
it was a very profound, for me it was a very profound experience. It was a way of revisiting the story in a way I'd never done before.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know why. Sometimes, and I've shared this on internet before, people have a much constructing idea about it. I love it when audiobooks are narrated by the author themselves rather than when they're narrated by a paid voiceover artist.
Right.
I'm not trying to speak down on voiceover artists, but sometimes I consider voiceover artists like a middleman. Yeah. But
Right.
compared to if the author tell their own story, like I was like, if it's coming from the author, then it's like it's a first hand message being
Right.
delivered to you
Right.
directly. Because they will tell you how the tone, the characters, how they want. It's so personal than a voiceover artist. Just my take and opinions, though.
Well, yes, and of course some authors don't have a good voice or good delivery. So in that respect, a
Yeah,
voiceover artist or an
would
actor
help. Yeah,
is better. But for me, I do have the voice, I do have the ability to do it, and it
yeah,
was very hard work. By the way, it's very hard work to do that.
yeah.
Um, but it was amazing. It was powerful. It was powerful to, you know, I'm eccentric in a lot of ways, and one of the ways I'm eccentric is I often read aloud as I'm writing,
Oh wow, that's
which can
amazing.
look really interesting if I'm sitting in Starbucks writing and I'm kind of reading aloud. But
Oh,
but it's different to kind of mumble as you write
yeah.
and to speak clearly for an audience.
Mm,
And I've read my book at events, and I've read my books on interviews like these, but
yeah.
to read in a sustained way the entire book for an audience, it was profound.
Wow.
It was profound to revisit in a sense, it was like revisiting the story as I wrote it.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Mark David Gerson books directly on Amazon, on Barnes& and Nobles, and his website, and also on other platforms. I also left links to his social media pages for possible
Great.
followings. So thank you so much, Mark David, for accepting the
Pleasure.
invitation to be featured on P English Literature. I must say this is more than awesome. Very great, quite exciting, lovely and fun having this conversation with you around your trunkload of titles. Thank you so much for coming on.
It was a pleasure.